You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello everyone and welcome to History of the Great War Revisited, Episode 7, the Anglo-German Naval Arms Race, Fischer's Last Years. While the tensions between Britain and Germany had been on the rise in the years after the creation of the Dreadnought and the 1906 German Naval Novel, after the implementation of the 1908 naval law in Germany, the naval arms race hit a new level of intensity. These were the two leading economies in Europe, engaging in a straight-up, head-to-head building contest of battleships and battlecruisers. In this episode, we will review the planned building tempo in Britain and Germany's reaction to it before discussing the removal of Fischer from the Admiralty. Fischer had just honestly made too many enemies during his time as First Sea Lord, and he was already well past the normal age of retirement, and this made his exit almost inevitable. It was just a question of when. He would be succeeded by a series of First Sea Lords which would have to navigate the Royal Navy through several political crises in the last years before the First World War. We will close out this episode by discussing the growing international support for some kind of arms limitation treaty, which would sort of be the precursor to the naval treaties that would be negotiated after the First World War. Just a reminder of what was happening in London during these years. While the Royal Navy had generally strong support for all the 1800s and into the 1900s, there were growing concerns about the continued expansion of the naval budget in the years before Fischer became First Sea Lord. Then in 1906, Fischer was able, through the reforms that he put in place, to reduce the naval estimate, which was seen as a major victory by the government. While this was a momentary victory, it did not resolve the conflict that would grow in the years that followed between those who wanted further cuts to the naval estimates and naval building, and those who believed that it was essential for the survival of the British Empire for those same estimates and building programs to be increased. Fischer would be caught between these two groups. He really did want to turn the Royal Navy into a lean, mean fighting machine, but there were limits to what could be done to make it lean while also retaining the naval power required to meet what many thought to be the Royal Navy's essential functions. There were two important areas in which Fischer would begin to feel serious pressure in the years after 1907, from inside the Navy itself and from those outside the government. When Fischer moved into the position of First Sea Lord and began to implement some of his reforms, there was always going to be those who disagreed with his actions. The introduction of the Dreadnought was one of these reforms, that in hindsight is very easy to claim was necessary, but for many at the time it seemed like a needless action that squandered a Royal Naval advantage that had been built up over decades of pre-Dreadnought construction. But the root of Fischer's downfall would not be the Dreadnought, and it would instead be an inquiry into the Admiralty prompted by none other than Lord Beresford. Lord Beresford had been the Commander-in-Chief of the Home Fleet, and thought he was going to replace Fischer when he retired. But when this did not happen, and given the incredible rockiness of their relationship, Beresford made it clear that he was unhappy. Beresford was also a well-connected man, and as the civilian leaders were growing frustrated with Fischer's resistance to further naval cuts, Beresford would let it be known that if he was the First Sea Lord, the estimates would certainly be reduced further. This is just one of many ways that Beresford would go outside the Navy to air his grievances, which would become a larger and larger problem throughout 1908. In April 1908, a new First Lord of the Admiralty would be named. This was the highest political appointee that would oversee the Navy, and it would be Reginald McKenna. And after taking up his new office, Fischer made it clear that Beresford was a problem, but nothing had yet been done due to concerns about what the fallout of such actions would be. Besides, in the summer of 1908, there were other things to worry about, like the continued debates about future building programs. During 1908, the naval leaders would propose 4 dreadnoughts to be laid down in 1908, with an early proposal for 6 dreadnoughts in 1909. This was far above what the government hoped for. In fact, McKenna had been put in his position due to his earlier expressed views that the Navy should cut its budget, but he had given his full support to this new expanded plan. This is just one instance of something that would happen several times in the decades before the First World War. Essentially, throughout all these years, the closer that a politician got to the Royal Navy, regardless of their previously held convictions, the stronger they would support further spending by the Navy. Along with the impact more knowledge had on individuals, there would be multiple times where the Navy would make its case for its budget in detail to the cabinet and the Prime Minister, and very often they would also come away from those conversations approving the larger budgets. The core of this phenomenon was a shared understanding of why the Navy was needed and what it needed to do to achieve its missions, which was to protect the entire British Empire and all of its interests from all foreign navies. But before Fisher left his position in 1910, between the years 1908 and 1910, he would be in almost constant conflict with the government due to tensions between those who wanted naval spending cuts and those who wanted naval spending increases. In early 1909, when news of the German plans to build 4 dreadnoughts in the next fiscal year became confirmed, there were many who wanted to drastically increase British building commitment. Instead of 4 or 6, the number started to be 8. This plan for this massive escalation in building tempo was due at least partially to an overreaction due to concerns from earlier years that the British were already not building a sufficient number of ships to meet the German challenge. And so, when their tempo went to 4, it was felt that it was the moment that the Royal Navy needed to catch back up. This mindset and the naval scare that caused it was problematic because one of the core election promises of the Liberal Party was that it would reduce spending on armaments, not double it. There was widespread support for these reductions, at least when the Liberal government came to power in 1908. The compromise that was put forth by Asquith, as we discussed last episode, was that some would be built in 1909 and then 1910 would see 4 more, as trying to find a compromise. But these would soon become necessary because of the building of Italian and Austrian dreadnoughts. McKenna would then go before the Commons and state that, quote, after very anxious and careful examination of the conditions of shipbuilding in foreign countries, the government have come to the conclusion that it is desirable to take all the necessary steps to ensure that the second 4 ship referred to in this year's program should be completed by March 1912, end quote. That means they had to be laid down sometime in early 1910. When this was announced in the British Commons, of course, it became public knowledge in many areas, including Germany. And the German plan for building 4 ships for several years starting in 1909 was based on the idea that the British could not or would not match that number in the long term. The announcement of what amounted to an 8 tempo for the year made it clear that they were determined to make a clear statement that the supremacy of the Royal Navy in capital ships was a fact, regardless of what other countries decided to build. Tirpitz still believed that the British could not maintain a 2-power standard over the long term, and so he was betting on them slowing down eventually. The problem for Tirpitz was that Germany's own construction was scheduled to be reduced to a 2-tempo in 1911, which would be easy for the British to match and exceed. This would also be the period when Tirpitz and other German leaders began to seriously consider a possible future where an arms limitation treaty, or at least a self-imposed construction limitation, might be the best option. At this point, these discussions generally revolved around the German Navy accepting a 2-3 or a 3-4 ratio of British supremacy. The reason that this was seen as sufficient was that the British also had so many other commitments, the Mediterranean, all over the world. When discussing the plans of the Germans to maybe work out a ratio of ships to build, or the British reacting to German building programs, it's important to keep in mind yet there was constant paranoia on both sides that the other country was building or preparing to build more than they were claiming publicly. It was very difficult to hide a ship that was being built. They're pretty noticeable, and obviously they are a ship, and the hull, and you can't really hide or make it look like it's something else. But parts that took the longest, things like guns and gun mountings and some of the machinery, they were way easier to hide. This meant that either side could be planning on an unannounced increase in building tempo, and they could stockpile all these difficult pieces to manufacture to make it happen. This led to a bit of uncertainty when trying to predict what the other side was going to do one year to the next, and there was always that threat, somewhere deep in the back of people's minds, that there was going to be an explosion of building on the other side. While the speed at which the British and German navies were building capital ships was increasing, and they were hesitant to trust each other, there was growing support for some kind of international agreement around naval construction. Now, this was not totally unheard of at this point in history. There were discussions, there were pushes for other kinds of international arms limitations agreements. These efforts were not always wholly or even primarily focused on naval armaments, but they're probably worth discussing here due to the groundwork that they would lay for later discussions that would be focused strictly on naval limitation. In April 1906, at the proposal of Russia, the Hague Peace Conference was reconvened. Initially, there was an announcement made that there would not be any discussions of arms limitations at the conference. This announcement was made to secure support from all countries to attend, some of which probably would have chosen to stay home if they were going to have to talk about arms limitation. The British government, seeing an opportunity, joined the Italian and American leaders in calling for arms limitations to be added to the conference. Germany, Austria, France, and Russia refused to discuss it, but this was still seen as a win by the British politicians because they could claim, hey, they tried. In 1906, at the same time, the American President Theodore Roosevelt began to openly discuss a battleship limitation plan. This plan was never taken seriously by the only powers that really mattered, which were Germany and Britain, but it is interesting to note because this proposal had one of the hallmarks of the interwar treaties, like tonnage limitations and armament size restrictions. Another Hague Conference would be held in 1907, with the British still attempting to push for arms limitation, but the other power studiously avoided it. These discussions would be held before the 1908 Naval was passed by Germany, the point at which the naval arms race would escalate. And in fact, it was the failure of the 1907 Hague Conference that caused the Germans to feel that kind of freed them to increase their building programs, which the British would meet and exceed, kicking off all the events that we've discussed over the last 2 episodes. I point out all this here because it is good to note that there was a growing level of support for this arms building process and constant escalation to end. It was growing in Britain. They were constantly looking for these limitations, although of course they always wanted them on their terms. And in Germany, it would begin to build as well. This would eventually lead to direct conversations between Britain and Germany, but it would be years after this. It would be years after the real escalation had started. This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. Do you have self-care non-negotiables? Maybe you go for a walk, or really take your time with that first caffeinated beverage in the morning. But maybe you need to add something new. Maybe you need to add in some therapy, creating a therapy day. Maybe that's what you're missing. But that's like a whole new thing to do. And that's where BetterHelp can come in. If you've ever considered therapy, it could not be easier than with BetterHelp. All it takes is a brief questionnaire, which BetterHelp uses to match you with a licensed therapist. It's easy, it's convenient, it's flexible, removing as many barriers as possible between you and therapy. So never skip therapy day with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/GW to get 10% off of your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/GW. Back in London, the political situation between Beresford and Fisher just kept getting worse. Very soon after Beresford exited the Navy in 1909, his attacks on Fisher and his naval policies would increase in ferocity. The redistribution of the forces by Fisher, which concentrated more power in home waters, left the Empire vulnerable, according to Beresford. Fisher was focusing too much on the big ships and not enough on support ships like light cruisers and destroyers. Beresford also claimed that the Admiralty was simply not ready to go to war to protect the Empire, the whole reason it existed. In 1910, things would begin to be serious. On April 2nd, he wrote a detailed letter to the Prime Minister stating that he would take his case public if the government did not do something to address his concerns. Given this pressure and concerns about a public argument reducing the prestige of the Navy, a new subcommittee within the Committee of Imperial Defense was created to investigate the accusations. The committee would meet 15 times between April and July 1909. During the very first meeting, Beresford would appear for questioning. According to many of the accounts of his discussions with the committee, it quickly became clear that he could not really back up any of his accusations. It also was soon revealed that Beresford was receiving information, which should not have been shared with him, from sources in the Admiralty. During these meetings, Fisher was not directly involved, and he only spoke to the committee when direct questions were asked of him. After all the meetings, the result was a statement by the committee that they did not feel that the arrangements made by the Admiralty had ever placed the Empire in any form of danger. The decisions made by the Admiralty were all very defensible, even if some people may not agree with them. The largest problem that was noted was that any situation where the board of the Admiralty and the First Sea Lord did not have a good relationship with the Commander-in-Chief of the Channel Fleet, which Beresford had been at the time, was not an arrangement that was good for the Royal Navy. In one paragraph, the report would state, quote, "The board of the Admiralty do not appear to have taken Lord Charles Beresford sufficiently into their confidence as to the reasons for dispositions to which he took exception, and Lord Charles Beresford, on the other hand, appears to have failed to appreciate and carry out the spirit of the instructions of the board and to recognize their paramount authority." End quote. This bit of the report is where Fisher drew issue, even though the entire report was without any real further indictment of his actions. The report was generally considered a complete victory, a vindication of all of Fisher's actions, but he still resented the fact that there was even the slightest shadow of doubt, and that it was not a full-throated support for everything he'd done. This would be one of the causes for Fisher to discuss his resignation with the Prime Minister and First Lord of the Admiralty, McKenna. Arrangements were made and finalized on October 20th. The agreement was that Fisher would resign in November, and then he would be made a baron. Fisher was hoping to be made a viscount, but he was not able to swing it, apparently after it was realized that not a single First Sea Lord in history had been given anything higher than a barony, so he became a baron. He would take into his motto, "Fear God and dread not," which he would put on his coat of arms, which was and remains just fantastic. Fear God and dread not. It's great. Fisher would depart after just 5 years as First Sea Lord, and after having kicked off the most dramatic changes in naval construction since the end of the Age of Sail. He had also put in place important reforms that allowed the Royal Navy to make a shift into the next century. It was also maybe the right time for him to leave. Fisher had always been an abrasive individual, and over time that abrasiveness continued to build, and this resulted in more resentment to Fisher from within the leadership of the Royal Navy and within the government, even if most of it did not bubble out into public like with Beresford. Fisher would not be gone for long though, and he would make it back to the Admiralty when the war started. Fisher would be replaced by Sir Arthur Wilson. Wilson was very close in age to the retirement for admirals, but he was still brought in to replace Fisher by promoting him to Admiral of the Fleet, which had a 5-year later retirement age attached to it. Wilson, he was not a great First Sea Lord, let's just be honest. To his credit, even though he knew that he had some deficiencies where it mattered. During his time with the fleet, he had actively avoided politicians, journalists, and all of the arguments that happened at the Admiralty, which made him almost uniquely acceptable to all the parties involved, even though it didn't seem like he wanted the job very much. The problem was that even Wilson saw himself as a person who was far better as a commander afloat instead of working through the administrative tasks at the Admiralty. One of the largest problems in this regard was a failure to delegate, which when managing a fleet at sea could be functional, but in a position like the First Sea Lord, where the work and decisions were endless, delegation was mandatory. Wilson would oversee the 1910 estimates, which were originally set at a number of 4 capital ships. This decision was made in November 1909, but just a month later, the number would be increased to 6. Once again, the catalyst for this change was news from the Mediterranean, where Austria had started 2 dreadnoughts. The move to 6 was acceptable by the Liberals, but only with great reluctance, as there was already the growing opinion that 6 would once again be required the next year in 1911. This reluctance manifested in calls to begin some form of negotiations with Germany, something that would prevent the constant increases in naval construction. In July 1910, these negotiations would begin, and they would continue off and on for almost 2 years, and they would accomplish very little. The reason for this failure to come to an agreement mostly revolved around the refusal of the Germans to proactively reduce construction, and the refusal of the British to enter into an agreement that traded their freedom of movement in a European conflict in exchange for naval security. The negotiations were not assisted by the period of increased tensions, which was kicked off by the Agadir crisis in 1911. The Agadir crisis began with the revolt of the Sultan of Morocco against the French who controlled the region. This revolt would be partially precipitated by French actions over the previous years, as they had tried to expand their power beyond the agreed-upon limits in the treaty that had ended the first Moroccan crisis in 1906. The French would then dispatch a military force to Fez in the hopes of putting down the revolt. This action was in itself a violation of previously signed treaties, but probably would, not have caused a huge problem for the powers in Europe. It was a country dealing with one of its colonies, whatever. In fact, this entire incident likely would have barely been worth a footnote in any history book about the First World War, except for the fact that a German ship appeared in Agadir. This ship was the German gunboat SMS Panther, which had previously been on station in southwest Africa and was on its way back to Germany. The decision had been made before it started its journey and before the revolt in Morocco became serious that the Panther would stop in a Moroccan port on its way home, and in this case that port would be Agadir. There were no problems at the time that the decisions were made to make this happen. But by the time it arrived, the arrival of the ship did not please the French, and it caused great concern in London. The British had been and always were fearful of Germany establishing a large naval base outside of Germany or their far-flung colonies. Any German naval base anywhere in the world was an area that they could use to base commerce raiders out of, which in fact happened during the First World War. Agadir, if it became a German base with its positioning on the Atlantic, would have been perfect for the purpose of commerce raiding. Now, there were never any serious plans by the Germans to actually construct a permanent naval base at Agadir, but that did not really matter. Just the idea of such a threat caused great concern in London, which caused them, in retrospect, to really overreact. In Berlin, Tirpitz used this reaction to bolster support for another naval novelle. The incident would eventually blow over entirely, with an agreement reached in October 1911, which did not make any serious changes to the situation, either in North Africa or Europe. But just the fact that the British had felt threatened, that they had mentioned it, that they had made such a big deal about Agadir, had made the Germans and the German population and the German politicians more ready and willing to build more ships. In London, the most important outcome of the Agadir crisis, at least, among the British political and military leaders, was that the nation did not appear as ready for war as they previously thought. During the Agadir crisis, there was real concern among British leaders that war with Germany was imminent. They were very, very concerned. Wilson saw no possibility of such a war occurring, and in fact, at the height of the crisis, he'd went off on a planned hunting trip to Scotland. When the British cabinet inquired into the plans of the Royal Navy if a war were to start, they received essentially the equivalent of a shrug. This caused great concern, and so on August 23rd, Asquith called a secret meeting with the Committee of Imperial Defense and representatives from the Army and Navy, with Sir William Nicholson, Chief of the Imperial General Staff, Sir Henry Wilson, Director of Military Operations, and Sir Arthur Wilson, First Sea Lord, all asked to present their plans in case of a war with Germany. Sir Henry Wilson went first, presenting the Army's plan of close cooperation with the French and for an expeditionary force to be sent to assist them. At this point, these plans were pretty close to what would eventually happen in 1911. When the Navy's plan was presented, it was a bit less impressive and maybe a bit less coherent. Whereas Henry Wilson and the Army had presented detailed plans, very specific plans, the Navy really only had a vague outline. They knew that they wanted to start with a close blockade of Germany, believed that this would provoke the Germans into a large sea battle, which, of course, the British would win. When this was complete and the German fleet was removed from the sea, the Navy then believed that the British Expeditionary Force, instead of going to France, should instead go to Heligoland to fully put the German fleet out of action. The Navy's viewpoint was that the British Expeditionary Force was too small to get involved in the main fighting on the continent, and if it joined the French forces, it would just get swallowed up by the German army. Therefore, it should be used in a cooperation with the Navy to strike at places that only the Royal Navy could reach, perhaps the Baltic as well. It could even threaten Berlin, if you really wanted to go all the way. These would all be huge operations, but the presentation made by Arthur Wilson at the meeting was very light on how the Royal Navy planned to actually make any of these happen. It also very quickly became clear that the Army plans and the plans of the Royal Navy were totally divergent, and if nothing else, something had to be done to bring them into a unified strategy. Both sides did not want to give in to the other's plans. Specifically, the Royal Navy believed that the German fleet had to be dealt with before the BEF could be sent anywhere. This was a critical piece for discussion because the plans as designed by the Army had the BEF in France to meet the first German attack, just like it would be in 1914. Even if the heads of the Army and Royal Navy could not come to an agreement on even this first issue, the politicians present were more than willing to tip the scales. Arthur Wilson's problem in this regard was that Henry Wilson had given a far better presentation of the Army's plans. Not only was the plan more detailed to begin with, but Henry Wilson was simply a better presenter. This meant that when the meeting ended, even though no official decision had been made between the two sets of military leaders, many members of the committee were in favor of the Army's plan to send the BEF quickly. It's no coincidence that after this meeting, the Secretary of State for War, Haldane, would begin to push for serious changes at the Admiralty. The topic of war plans of the Royal Navy became a major talking point, and during this period it's an interesting one to look at. The British Army and its general staff spent a tremendous amount of time building, maintaining, and evaluating war plans. In peacetime, it was a major part of the reason that the general staff existed in the first place. There wasn't an equivalent planning body for the Navy, and in fact, Fisher had been actively hostile to such a planning body. He would instead say that he, as the first Sea Lord, had the war plans in his head, and he did not need to detail them out to anybody. This was frustrating for the Army and for the government, as it made it more difficult to plan for what the Navy was going to do, just like what was displayed in that meeting after the Agadir crisis. Fisher had been claiming this for years, though, basically since he became the first Sea Lord. He had been planning, I guess. And there was one major difference between Fisher and Wilson. Fisher could swing it, right? He could just go for it at any time and talk about these plans. He really had given it thought, and he could probably convince other people that he had a really good plan in place. Wilson just couldn't swing it. He just couldn't do it. And this really meant that the Royal Navy after Fisher needed these plans, or the government thought that it needed these plans. And to make those plans, there would need to be serious changes at the Admiralty. Just months before Fisher's dismissal, there had been a renewed attempt to convince Fisher that the creation of some kind of naval general staff, even if it had a completely different name, would at the very least be seen as a positive step by others within the government. These changes would not be enacted, and instead, Fisher and then his successor Wilson still held complete control of the Royal Navy and didn't really want to devolve their power to a general staff of any kind. In both cases, they wanted to keep control themselves. But again, even the same with the war plans, and with this, nobody was going to push Fisher on this. Fisher was the type of person who could just make these kinds of things work. He gave people confidence that he knew what he was doing and that things would happen correctly. Wilson was none of those things. This meant that after the Agadir crisis, Asquith was convinced by Haldane to force the Admiralty to create a war staff, and both the First Sea Lord and the First Lord of the Admiralty would have to be replaced to make this happen. This would be the point where Winston Churchill would get involved with the Admiralty, which is a story best left for next episode.